Okay, now that we are done with the experiments that we were doing based on condensation, whereby we were learning about how condensation takes place. What happened was we put two glasses. One glass had water and the other glass had water and a bit of ice. So what happened with the glass that had ice is that it started having a form of water that was forming on its exterior, right? While this water was forming, we then called this water, or this form of liquid, we called it water vapor. So now it's time that we move from that to the next phase of our lesson. So right now, I want you guys to pay attention to what I'm going to do. So what we have here is a bucket that has water, half-filled water, and then we have a cloth. This is a dry cloth. I just need one person to tell me what happens when a person washes their clothing, right? They wash their clothing and then they hang it outside. Why is it that when a person hangs their clothing outside, the clothes then get dry? What helps the clothing to get dry as time proceeds? That's correct, the sun. And sometimes the wind also assists in that, because the wind, what happens is that when you take your clothing, for example, and then you put it in water, okay? We have over. It comes out wet. It comes out wet. So when you hang it outside, the sun hits this, and then the water that is on this starts to evaporate. And then when it evaporates, this is then left dry. Okay? That was easy and straightforward for you guys to understand. Okay, my hands away. Now that we know what happens, we need to move on to an important phenomenon. That phenomenon is called the water cycle. Now this is a bit of a detailed type of water cycle. Okay, this thing actually starts over here on this simple one. Okay, so what happens is that evaporation takes place, and then condensation, and then precipitation. So these are scientific words that are used to describe what processes take place in the water cycle. So what we have here is just a river, a river. We have a river, and what happens is that on a sunny day, the sun's rays hit the river, alright? When that happens, water from the river evaporates. Okay, it evaporates to the clouds, and even though that is not visible, but then it kind of happens in the form of water vapor. So the sun hits the river with its heat, and then the water vapor evaporates to form clouds. So now, once the clouds have been formed, or once the clouds form, and once the water in the clouds becomes very heavy, the clouds then release rain. It can be rain, it can be hail, it can be, different types of precipitation. So it releases some rain like this, precipitates, or it rains onto different mountains, and then two processes take place, okay? There's infiltration. Now infiltration is a process whereby water from, the sky penetrates into the land. It could be the soil or the mountain or plants, but water penetrates inside. I guys remember that's a big word for you guys, but another word for penetrate is seep into, which means it goes inside. So the water penetrates inside the surface, and then some water runs off, and that's why we call this run off, because not all water penetrates, but some water runs off back into the river. It runs off back into the river. It runs back to the river. So now what's left for us to do is explain each process one by one. from evaporation to condensation to precipitation to runoff and to infiltration. So now the evaporation yethu, right over here. That's the first process. So what happens is that when the water cycle starts, it starts with evaporation, right? It is a process whereby water at the surface turns into water vapor. And water vapor, we've already explained what that was at the beginning of the lesson. So these small water droplets are heated up by the sun and they start to move upwards, you know. We can't see them, but they're there. So these water bodies, like oceans and seas and lakes and rivers, they are the main sources of evaporation. Who can tell me why that is so? It's crazy. It's because these sources have water, and water is the main reason why evaporation takes place, or the main reason why even the water cycle is present. So through evaporation, more water moves from the hydrosphere to the atmosphere, and water evaporates. It reduces temperature around us. So if we've seen this, it usually happens olwandle, you know, when you go to a holiday at the beach or something like that, you find that places that are near the ocean are very cool, like Durban. Durban is a very cool place. So my question is, why is it that the sun is the catalyst of the water cycle? Why is it that we say the sun is the one that is responsible for the water cycle to take place? Learning. Yes. So yes, without the sun that heats the water and causes evaporation, that means the water cycle would never be there. So that's why we say the sun catalyzes the process of evaporation. Next up, we have condensation. Condensation, it takes place right there at the top by the clouds. Okay, it takes place by the clouds. So as water evaporates, as water moves upwards, as water evaporates, it rises into the atmosphere. Atmosphere, so we say as at high altitudes, the water vapor changes into very tiny particles of ice or water. So that's why when it precipitates, sometimes it may precipitate ice or precipitate water. It's because when water reaches the top regions of the clouds, it divides into smaller particles, and then these particles can be water or ice. And this process here is the condensation, obviously, because these particles they move closer together. Once they've separated, they move closer together. Once they move closer together, they form gigantic dark clouds, and then once these clouds are huge and cannot hold the rain or the ice any longer, it then begins to rain or precipitates. That's the scientific word. Okay guys, I'm gonna get different types of precipitations or forms of precipitations that we have. We've already mentioned them. I'm just asking for the sake of asking. Asand, rain, okay, hail, okay, slit, that's correct, and snow. And then the following process is a runoff. We said the runoff is whereby water that precipitates, it moves on the surface of the ground, like it does when it moves down the mountain or something like that, And then the last process is infiltration. We said that infiltration is whereby water seeps inside or into the mountain, it seeps into the mountain or the sand or whatever is it that it seeps into that has pores for it to seep into. Thank you.